You might be wondering how the Representation of the People Acts fit together and which law controls what for your UPSC preparation. By the end of this video, you will be completely clear about the roles of the 1950 and 1951 Acts and the Delimitation Act and why they matter for questions you will face. Think of the election framework as two parts: a blueprint that decides how many seats and where they go, and a rule book that decides how elections are run. The 1950 Act sets the blueprint, and the 1951 Act supplies the rule book. First, let us visualize the Representation of the People Act 1950 as the stadium seating plan, where Articles 81 and 170 tell you the maximum seats in Parliament and state assemblies, and the principles for dividing those seats among states. The 1950 Act used the population as on 1st March 1950 as the basis for allotting seats, which is why the Act often comes up with questions about historical population basis. The Act also gave the President power, after consulting the Election Commission, to delimit constituencies so that each seat represents roughly equal population. And that power is a key point for exam questions. The 1950 Act covered registration of electors for parliamentary, assembly, and council constituencies and laid down basic qualifications and disqualifications for enrollment on the voters' list. You may ask why electoral rolls were ready so soon. That was because the Constituent Assembly Secretariat had already started preparing rolls ahead of the first elections. Now picture the Representation of the People Act 1951 as the operations manual for running elections inside that stadium. It fills gaps the 1950 Act left open. The 1951 Act sets out who can be a member of Parliament or state legislatures, how general elections are notified, and the administrative machinery that runs the show. It covers nomination of candidates, the role of candidates and their agents at polling, the poll itself, counting of votes, and publication of results. So, procedural questions in UPSC often point back to these provisions. Importantly, the 1951 Act defines corrupt practices and electoral offences and prescribes penalties, which is the legal backbone for ensuring free and fair elections. The Act also requires candidates to declare assets and liabilities and to keep an account of election expenses, making transparency and accountability examinable themes. For disputes, the Act provides election petition procedures, trials before high courts, appeals to the Supreme Court, and bars civil courts from intervening in election matters, a procedural safeguard often tested in mains. You might be confused about delimitation later on. That is where the Delimitation Act 2002 comes into play to correct constituency distortions caused by uneven population growth. Articles 82 and 170 authorized readjustment based on census data set by Parliament, and the Delimitation Act 2002 set up a commission to redraw boundaries using the 2001 census. The aim was simple: fix the uneven sizes of constituencies that arose because the previous delimitation had used the 1971 census and migration had changed population distribution. Articles 330 and 332 were used to refix the number of seats reserved for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, based on updated census figures. And that linkage between delimitation and reservation is often a question focus. Apart from these three laws, several allied statutes and rules shape electoral law, such as the Parliament Prevention of Disqualification Act 1959 and rules on registration of electors and conduct of elections. Also remember orders like the Election Symbols Order 1968 and the Registration of Political Parties Order 1992, which regulate party identity and registration. Small details that can appear in prelims. For UPSC strategy, be clear on which act handles what. 1950 for seat allocation and voter rolls, 1951 for conduct and offences, and the Delimitation Act for boundary adjustment. That distinction is frequently examined. A quick mental map helps. 1950 equals blueprint and seats. 1951 equals rules and penalties. Delimitation acts equal boundary fixes based on a census year. As an analogy, think of a national election like a nationwide exam, where the 1950 Act decides how many exam halls and seats. The Delimitation Act decides where those halls are, and the 1951 Act sets the exam rules and invigilation standards. Key terms to memorize for UPSC. Articles 81, 170, 171, 82, 330, 332, and Article 326 in context with the Acts. Because questions often link constitutional provisions with statutory details. Also note the practical significance. These acts work together to prevent criminals from entering representative bodies, promote transparency through asset declarations, and curb corrupt practices like booth capturing and bribery. Before we wrap up, remember that the Delimitation Commission is independent, but its orders have the force of law after publication. So commissions and their legal status can be a mains answer point. Summing up simply, Representation of the People Act 1950 allocates seats and sets up roles. 1951 runs the election machinery and punishes offences. And the Delimitation Act redraws constituencies based on census data. And towards the end, we will understand a key idea that most UPSC aspirants miss: the difference between allocation of seats and delimitation of boundaries. One is about numbers, the other about geography and balance. Keep these distinctions crisp and link each provision to the relevant article and practical effect, and you will answer both prelims and mains with confidence. If you want a quick revision sheet, focus on the functions, key sections, and linked articles for each act, and practice by mapping past UPSC questions to these laws. You are getting there. These topics make more sense when you visualize the process rather than memorize lines of law. For more structured lessons, examples, and past question links, continue your preparation with EduRev, where these concepts are broken down into bite-sized notes and quizzes. Good luck with your revision, and remember that clarity on who does what in election law will earn you solid marks in both prelims and mains.